I I come first with a confession. Unlike the rest of this august group, I am not a international industrial relations expert. My interest in this area is as a human rights lawyer, so I'm very interested in the idea that globally women are represented so disproportionately in precarious, informal and poorly paid work, including domestic work. So my interest in this topic came from trying to influence the Brisbane G20 summit back in 2014, which led to me spending a lot of time with feminist economists, and there's not so many of those around, to try to influence the Australian government to set a female labour participation goal and to encourage that in the G20. And it sort of happened. The governments all decided to set a goal to increase their female labour participation rates at 15% by 2030. And roughly speaking, it was reasonably on track in most of the G20 economies until the COVID pandemic. But even then, there was deep rumblings around what would happen in relation to the rise of automation. So I suppose that my purpose in talking this through with this group is trying to think in a more academic sense around some of these policy processes to think about, I guess, how to some sense making about these big mega trends. So I'll just take you through it one by one. But the first idea, I guess, is for me a question about how much the future of work has been responsive to gender issues. My argument is barely at all. They keep saying increase female labour participation rates, but then we're going to transition to this automation age, and we will politically prioritise the demands of blue-collar men's jobs, and we will then, in COVID, suddenly understand what the lives of frontline female workers look like in the health industry. And then we've got this added level of what about sustainable jobs? So thank you so much for that previous presentation. The idea of, we've also got climate change coming as we're still thinking about the pandemic. We're also thinking about what might be the impact on the future of work from climate. And as you all heard, it was technology, technology, technology. Industrialists, financiers, technologists as the future of our climate solutions. So let's get back to the beginning. So my overall thesis in this presentation is I would like the conversation to be far more focused on social protections, and also the idea that women should be in a position to actually shape the future of work instead of having to adjust to this particular automation vision that seems to be has entered the discourse to such an extent that it seems now inevitable, and that we must have learnt things from the COVID crisis that will help us understand what the future of work trends might look like in terms of the types of policy interventions we need. And generally speaking, most of the sort of feminist work on this essentially says we need far more transition policies now that put women on a path to more productive, better paid, decent work, and failing to do so might mean a complete reversal in everything we've gained in female labour participation. So in other words, they're saying what we've seen in COVID is basically a dress rehearsal for what we might see in the future because of the twin trends of automation and climate change responses and adaptation. So here you go. So just a bit of data first. So 740 million women around the world make their living in the informal economy, and so are therefore not counted in mainstream economic data. And in low-income countries, 92% of women are employed informally, compared with 87.5% of men. So it's just to make that point that traditional economic measures of the world of work are not counting a whole lot of people that it should be counting. And then when they are counting people, they're not counting a lot of care work, and that still is not recognised, as we all know, in proper GDP measures or or any of the data that we get. So this sort of time use data that we need to make proper policy decisions about women's work. Owing to the lack of adequate social protection packages, women are at a higher risk of harm from socio and economic shocks linked to measures that are being introduced both to curb the pandemic and then that are being introduced to create, the Industrial Revolution 4.0. Why you'd be wanting to recreate the Industrial Revolution given the current climate debate is also pretty questionable to us. So in terms of the G20, the gender kind of part of that, the W20, which Caitlin Byrne, my colleague, sits on, she took over from me. I've been trying to create recommendations that create pathways to more gender equitable societies emerging out of this pandemic. The idea that you could build back fairer or snap forward rather than snap back. And a lot of that is about making women's decent work resilient to shocks, including escalating climate impacts. So I want to share with this group that I'm in a state of despair about whether we're on that kind of trajectory at the moment, and that I'm arguing that we need much more urgency in this transition planning. All right, so if we think about COVID as an example of women's work experiencing shocks that might regress their progress in the paid or the formal economy, if we accept that's where we want. So we want decent work from a human rights point of view, in my view, not the kind of more capitalist idea of what is good work. So the UN has basically said that member states should have considered the following priority actions in their COVID-19 response and recovery plans, namely that women and women's organisations should be at the heart of COVID-19 planning task forces, and that there should be a strategic focus on transforming the inequities of unpaid care work into a new inclusive care economy that works for everyone, and that we need to design socio-economic plans with an intentional focus on the lives and futures of women and girls. So I just asked the group, do you feel that way about Australia's post-COVID responses? There was a lot of critique about the last budget, that women were almost completely forgotten, and it was all focused on tradies and construction, as well as the Queensland report as well. And so can we think harder about social protection as a crisis response tool to promote resilient societies in the wake of a shock? So even before the pandemic, I argue the need was desperately for countries to invest in a social protection floor. And the landmark 2011 report by Michelle Bachelet called Social Protection Floor for a Fair and Inclusive Globalisation was produced by the ILO, and it found that investing in social protection systems pays off in the short term by mitigating crises and in the long term by nurturing human development and productivity. So what I think COVID-19 has shown us is that in most countries, the administration and design of social safety net payments, the operation of the tax system and access to housing at the moment are inadequate for supporting diverse women across the globe during a crisis. So when we're talking about the future of work, it should have this social protection conversation that goes along beside it if we're to realise women's economic and social rights. And in doing this, if we have a social protection response that is adequate, it might help us reconsider how to conceptualise work, value care, and think about essential services which currently have limited or no social protection because they rely on market wages. What the heck would that look like? The UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls has listed some global good practice that they found around the world, and my favourite is Hawaii, who were the only place in the world that had a feminist COVID response plan, an overtly feminist COVID response plan. So a lot of these came from that plan. Providing economic support for domestic workers and low-income earners who have stopped working. So, basic JobKeeper, but JobKeeper that is more targeted at the informal sector as well. So it had less, you didn't have to be part of the formal market to be able to claim it. Providing extended paid leave for parents to take care of children or persons with disabilities who stay at home. Providing free childcare. Providing as opposed, Australia could do that. So Australia did do that for a brief shining moment and then stopped. Providing temporary housing and food for poor women. So this idea that you need to have, during COVID, Queensland magically resolved its homelessness crisis by placing people in international student accommodation in Wollongong. But it's not a permanent solution. But, it can be done when the state wants it to be done. Putting in place creative arrangements to support women victims of gender-based violence, particularly hotlines, online services, alerts. So what we saw in COVID was a range of alerts that happened in pharmacies and food stores that allowed women to raise the alarm without having to, because they were constantly monitored in domestic environments. Including shelters for women survivors in the list of essential services during emergencies. That's also very important for Queensland's disaster seasons. And authorising the use of telemedicine for reproductive health care at home. One of the things we've seen during COVID and that we're going to see during climate change, if the experience in Africa is any guide, is that women's reproductive health goes off a cliff. Access to contraception is severely compromised. So did we see diverse women represented on COVID-19 recovery committees and as the drafters of recovery plans around the world? No, we did not, and we're still not seeing that. And are we seeing gender-responsive budgeting to be applied across the COVID response and recovery? We're about to have the mid-year economic forecast for Australia, and I suggest it's not going to have a specific gender lens as it hasn't in the past. And where is the investment in social infrastructure? So the other issue, so that's the kind of what we've learnt from COVID. There's a few other issues about what we've learnt from automation and all that discussion about automation. And I get very torn here around supporting female entrepreneurship while making sure that means there's formal economies and just not allowed to be systematically hostile to women, which is, basically what we heard from David and Glenda this morning, a really excellent paper that fits in very well, the micro to the macro in this situation. So here it's all about what kind of transitions are going to be made by women in terms of technology adoption. And a recent McKinsey report said 40 million to 160 million may need to transition between occupations by 2030, often into high skilled roles. And if they don't, they will face a growing wage gap or leave in the labour market. And so what they need to be in the automation age, says McKinsey, is skilled, mobile and tech savvy, which is very difficult. So at the moment, McKinsey is pointing out that women are 70% of workers in healthcare, and we've seen how that's played out around the world during COVID, but less than 25% of all construction workers. And they are saying that we're not doing enough at the moment. This is McKinsey. We're not talking about a bunch of radical feminists here, but we're not doing enough at the moment to break down the barriers that women need to enter STEM industries, and that they need high priority investments into training, affordable transportation, but very importantly around stereotypes about occupations, and particularly supporting women in STEM professions and entrepreneurship, and that has to escalate rapidly. So I guess just to come to a close, I guess what we've, and I'm sorry, this is very high level, so I hope you're staying with me, but this idea that we came from a general idea of we need to increase female labour participation, but we're not going to do any structural reform to the labour market across the world, to we've had a massive COVID shock. What has that taught us about, yes, people can work more flexibly, but also we need all these social protection measures to help people during shocks to endure shocks. Then what do we know about climate change and what it's going to mean for us all? And then finally, what is automation going to mean for us all? And every single piece of solution is still about making women fit into a model that doesn't particularly change, that was predicated on the 18th century industrial man. And my fear is that female labour participation is going to plummet even further than it has during COVID. And, that the economy will still rely on gendered unpaid labour. So that's where I'm at. It's a despair, basically. So I'm really interested to share with this group those ideas, because I've done a lot of policy work, but I haven't turned it into an academic piece. So I'm really interested in what people think about that kind of narrative, and you know, just any reactions. That would be fantastic.